So throughout Persona 5, you play as the Phantom Thieves of Hearts, the heroes of justice who change the hearts of evildoers one heart at a time while gathering new members and new friends along the way. And while Persona 5 is definitely one of the best games to come out in recent memory, with the definitive edition Persona 5 Royal releasing just last year, I did end up finding one issue with it the first time I played through the regular Persona 5. As you go through the game and deal with these evil people, while the game made it extremely fun, going through and doing the same thing in different contexts was getting a little repetitive. Changing the hearts of someone who was evil eventually got to be a little routine, and I ended up wanting something more than just changing someone's heart because they were evil. But then, the game answered a question that I hadn't even thought to ask, and that question was, what if you changed the heart of someone who wasn't even a villain? And today, I want to explore that arc and how it ended up changing the game as a whole for me. So with that being said, let's dive right in. So as you go through the game as the Phantom Thieves of Hearts, you encounter these people who are pretty not good, and you have to change their hearts and make them confess to their misdeeds. At this point, you've dealt with 3 villains: Kamoshida, who's been harassing and abusing his students, Madarame, who's been plagiarizing art and also abusing his students, and Kaneshiro, who's a leader of a gang that's been using students to smuggle drugs all throughout Shibuya. Students are really not having a good time. And as the Phantom Thieves with your keen senses of justice, you can't let these acts go unpunished. So you end up running through the cognitions of these villains called palaces and face off against the shadow versions of the previously named villains to set things right. Now, why I bring this up is because up until this point, everything is pretty black and white. You're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And while the game as a whole is fun, having the same narrative structure from palace to palace gets pretty predictable. After you defeat the current villain, you figure that whoever you face next is gonna be some evil person that's doing some horrible thing, and you're gonna have to take them down, make them confess, and have the Phantom Thieves win in the end. We've done this for 3 palaces so far, and it feels like that's sort of becoming a standard. And while the game more than makes up for it with its fast-paced gameplay in the palaces, relaxing gameplay in the life simulator sections, and an amazing soundtrack to wrap it all up, the structure was dangerously close to becoming predictable and repetitive. And again, not to say that's a bad thing, because as I said before, I think the game does really well for itself. But at the same time, if the game had just stuck with that formula, it would have left me wanting something more than just finding a bad person doing bad things, beating them up, and repeating the cycle until the game's over. Because in a game focused on diving into the human mind, it really only focused on good versus evil, and while that's fine, the human mind is much more complex than those 2 sides of the spectrum. While it would have been a fun experience either way, it would have lacked that special something that just made things a bit more interesting. But once the next arc begins and the Phantom Thieves are introduced to the hurdle they need to overcome, things get a bit more complex. Once the Phantom Thieves are introduced to their next enemy, a hacktivist group called Medjed, they're introduced to someone named Alibaba. Alibaba then offers to help the Phantom Thieves deal with Medjed in exchange for changing someone's heart, and that person is Futaba Sakura. Now we learned that Futaba Sakura was in fact Alibaba and asked the Phantom Thieves to change her heart herself. And when I played this for the first time in the original Persona 5, that alone told me that things are going to be very different here. And as we learn more about Futaba's past with her mother committing suicide and her being blamed for it, the narrative begins to become a little bit more blurred. Because it's at this point that we learn that Futaba isn't anywhere close to evil. In fact, she's quite the opposite. She's really the victim in all of this. When compared to the people whose hearts we've changed in the story so far, Futaba's story is definitely a major outlier. Frankly, a breath of fresh air. Part of that has to do with where the arc takes place in the narrative, because it marks an important change of the story, because it opens the story to people who aren't actually evil yet still have palaces like Sai and Maruki. They're not necessarily evil people, but their cognitions are just as distorted as people like Kamoshida and Kaneshiro. It also uses a basic technique of writing in a pretty interesting way when Futaba's palace is introduced. In writing, there's a technique that some of you might know called the Rule of 3, and if you don't know what that is, it's basically saying that having things cut up into groups of 3 makes things more satisfying for the person who's experiencing that game or show or whatever it is. That's why you see a lot of groups of 3 characters in different forms of media like TV or video games, because after all, good things come in 3s. But at this point the game kind of uses that rule in an interesting way. Because if this game did follow that rule, then Futaba's arc and palace should have been the 3rd one. They would have had 2 palaces to set the precedent that the Phantom Thieves only go after the hearts of the wicked, and then have Futaba's arc come in and shake things up at number 3. But Futaba's palace is the 4th one. So having 3 palaces to establish the narrative that we only target evildoers makes the moral gray area that is Futaba's palace much more interesting. Persona 5 Royal is a long game. And while the first 3 villains you face off against are amazing and really fun stories to experience, shaking it up after sticking to the standard for what could easily be 50 plus hours of the game is honestly perfect to solidify the rules of that universe and surprise the player after we thought we knew what was happening. At this point, we spent 50 plus hours establishing that we only change the hearts of the oppressors, but we've never truly gotten a close look into the minds and the hearts of the oppressed. Futaba's mental state when we first meet her is a byproduct of the society that we've been fighting to actively change. So now, instead of fighting the villains themselves, Futaba's palace gives us the other side of that coin, and in my opinion makes it much more interesting than just fighting another villain. Futaba's shadow when we meet her isn't really evil, just defensive, and that in itself makes it this sort of gray area which provides a layer of complexity that honestly previous bosses lacked. And that rings true even down to minute things like the music. When you look at the track listing for Persona 5, each palace has two themes, the regular version and the another version that comes after it. However, for this palace theme, The Days When My Mother Was There, it switches that up and puts the another version first at number 58 and the normal version at 59 respectively. And if you listen to the another version, it sounds very ethereal and vague as it plays outside of the palace. But when you get to the normal version, which only plays once you enter the palace, it sounds much more emotionally charged with musical features like a wailing guitar to symbolize someone crying out in pain. And that enforces the narrative we see with Futaba's shadow, that she's kept everyone and everything at an arm's length since her mother died. But once you truly take a look into her character, you can see that there are deep emotional scars that have yet to be dealt with. And while the music has little impact on the story as a whole, it just shows that the developers really went out of their way to show that this palace is truly a different experience than any we've been to before. Which to me is a fantastic way to shake up the game's story and save it from just being a story that consists of fight the bad guys until you win. And even while we go through that story and go through that palace, the themes of the game shift and almost change entirely for that period. The themes of Persona 5 Royal are heavily based on the idea of rebellion. We've seen this when it comes to all the Phantom Thieves so far, especially with characters like Makoto, who in my opinion handles those themes the best. Persona 5 Royal is in more ways than one a social commentary about the injustices that are rooted in today's society, and it's our job as the protagonist to stand up against those injustices one villain at a time. But this palace is very different from other palaces. These themes become a little blurred when you get into Futaba's palace and learn more about what happened to her mother. Yes, the injustices are there, and by the end it's clear that she's ready to rebel against the people who faked her mother's death note, but it definitely doesn't feel that way by the end of this arc. The palace focused on us finding out the truth behind what happened to Futaba and how the blame that was placed upon her for her mother's death actually affected her. And by the time she receives her persona, it feels like the main themes of this palace were more about Futaba actually coming to terms with the truth about her mom's death and recovering from that trauma than rebelling against the society that killed her mom in the first place. Even the way she receives her persona is noticeably different than the way the others do. Every other person who awakened to a persona ended up ripping off their mask, which is representative of being free from the mask that society forces them to wear. But Futaba doesn't do that at all. She doesn't rip off her mask because she never wore one to begin with. Instead, the way she receives her persona is her shadow becoming her persona, which is way more in line than what happened in Persona 4 Golden than Persona 5 Royal. And I think that's appropriate here because she's not really rebelling against society. She's focused on finding the truth behind her mother's death and avenging her. And having the themes of rebellion be more of an undertone to a very character-driven palace puts a really unique spin on a game that, while fun, could have used a bit more complexity and motivation when it came to its characters, or at least up until that point in the game. Most of what we've seen so far from Persona 5 Royal and its themes are characters refusing to go along with the status quo, and that's personified by not only them getting their personas, but also defeating palace ruler after palace ruler. And while that's okay, having a character that switches it up and doesn't really care about all that is pretty refreshing. She later admits that she doesn't really care about changing people's hearts and just wants revenge for what happened to her mother. And while that still holds true to the game's theme of rebellion, it's more of a subtext in the case of Futaba's story. And all of that really serves to help the overall experience of Persona 5 Royal. Because Futaba's story is a really intriguing take on the concept of changing someone's cognition and answers the question of what if the Phantom Thieves changed the heart of someone who wasn't evil? And having this take place so deep into the story makes this all the more satisfying. Because setting the precedent that you only change the hearts of someone evil, then subverting those expectations by having someone who just wants to have a clear conscience is a great way to introduce different reasons why you would want to change someone's heart. And that to me makes for a much more interesting story and adds a lot more complexity than someone whose cognition has just been distorted for surface level reasons like money or power. And while other palace rulers like Sai and Maruku play off of that theme of not being evil as well, I think it was much more satisfying to experience it for the first time with the story of Futaba Sakura. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked what I had to say and want to hear more, go ahead and leave a like and consider subscribing. I like to do in-depth analysis and theories on this channel, and I'd love to have you become part of the community. But that's gonna be all from me today though, so I'll catch you next time. For now, this is Moose Wayne, signing off.